On today's episode of Locked On Wild, what can we expect from Marco Rossi this season? Well, it largely depends on where he gets put in the lineup.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome in to another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we preview the 2024-2025 season for Marco Rossi. We'll take a look at him being able to break out in 2023-2024. And we'll take a look at some of the lineup uncertainty that could lead to Rossi, at least to start the year, being in a bottom six role, something I'm just really not a fan of. My name is Seth Toupal, credentialed Wild media member and host of Locked On Wild since 2021. As we continue player previews, tomorrow we will take a look at the official training camp roster for the Minnesota Wild, just released today. So we'll dive into that in full force for you on tomorrow's show. But wanted to talk about Marco Rossi because this past season, he was one of only two players on the team that played in all 82 games. And you look up and down the board, he was fifth on the team in goals with 21, tied with Ryan Hartman. Had 40 total points, which if you look at where that ranked on the team this past season, Rossi was seventh on the team with 40 total points. After 19 games in 2022-2023 that really just did not go well, whether it be, where Rossi was put in the lineup and, just some inconsistencies in his game as well, just didn't work out really all that well. And for Rossi, full 82, was, in terms of shots on goal, was one of the top 10 on the team. He was sixth on the team in shots on goal with 167. Faceoffs, he won 335, lost 414, so he was at 44% in the faceoff circle and was third on the team in terms of faceoff wins behind Ryan Hartman and Eriksson. And so any way that you slice it, Marco Rossi was an important part of what the Minnesota Wild did, but I think he was, really a just a steadying presence for the Wild and a player who, at the baseline level, played hard every day. He talked about that in what I consider the quote of the year when asked after a game. He said, "I just go out every day and play as hard as I can, and kind of let the rest take care of itself." And it's hard not to be inspired by that as a guy who's 22 years old, considering what Rossi went through before his NHL career even began. Myocarditis, dealing with all that, getting himself back into hockey shape. He has overcome a lot of adversity throughout the early part of his career, and we saw some very impressive steps taken by Rossi this season that lead you to believe that he can use those as building blocks going forward and be a really integral part of what this team does going forward. He settled in as the second center after Eriksson got bumped up to the top line with Kirill, Kaprizov, and Matt Boldy. Rossi settled in as the second center the rest of the season. Now, production-wise, there was a dip in what really the rest of the team did from that February 7th date where we finally got the uniting of Boldy, Kaprizov, and Eriksson Ek. From then to the end of the season, there was a dip in production, to say the least. You look at Rossi's numbers. He had 12 points in the final 33 games of the season, but that was largely due to Matt Zuccarello, who had just 11 even-strength points on the season. Rossi didn't factor into the power play really all that much because of the guys that are on that top unit and the inconsistency of that second unit. And so even strength points down the stretch, Rossi had 7 goals and 2 even strength assists for 9 total points in the final 33 games. Matt Zuccarello was at 2 goals, 11 total points in the final 29 that he played. You got Marcus Johansson, who had 4 total points, even strength, in the final 29 games of the season. It's just a combination that didn't work. And with all of the attention and all of the scoring that Kaprizov, Eriksson Ek, and Boldy did down the stretch, that's got to be one of the key focal points for this Minnesota Wild team going into the season, which is why I think we have seen some of the rumblings from a lineup perspective that are going to, lead to trying to make more of a balanced lineup that is capable of hitting you with multiple scoring lines. Joe Smith did a one-on-one with John Hines to kind of set the tone for the season, and I want to read you a couple of passages from it that were really going to be something to keep an eye on here, especially during the preseason. And we'll start with the line combinations. What will the lines be? And Smith writes, there shouldn't be an overreaction on day one because the lines will be shuffled throughout camp. But one thing Hines and his staff are focused on is reuniting Ryan Hartman, Matt Zuccarello, and Kirill Kaprizov. That trio was dynamite together when Hartman racked up a career-high 34 goals in 2021-2022. The goal would be to make for a deeper forward group, not just relying on a Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Kirill Kaprizov line to dominate. So it could be, say, Eriksson Ek and with Boldy and Marcus Johansson, or Liam Ogren on line 2, and Foligno, Marco Rossi, and Yakov Trenin on line 3. As Hines says, we've had all kinds of discussions throughout the offseason with management, with our analytics department, with players at the end of the season, Hines said. We know there's been a lot of good combinations. Boldy, Ek, and Kaprizov was an excellent line, one of the best in the NHL. But looking at some different combinations and splitting those guys up in camp, we think it would be more advantageous to our team right now. Marco could probably fit in some of those roles. Hartman could fit in some of those roles. We're telling our players in camp that we're going to try some different things and give guys different opportunities to see what comes out on top at the end. And look, that sentiment in and of itself is not wrong, because the reality of the situation is that you are not going to get through the entirety of a season with 4 line combinations. That's just not how it works. And so using the preseason to try different things and to, try maybe some combinations that you don't necessarily use right away, but you could put in different game situations, that's how preseason should be. But listen to this passage in regards to what role will Marco Rossi play. Hines made it clear to Rossi in their summer chats that this would be a huge year for him, and Rossi took the advice to heart, skipping Olympic qualifiers for Austria and joining Wild teammates in workouts in mid-August. Rossi could end up as a third-line center with Foligno on his wing, but Hines also indicated the former first-round pick is in the mix for top 6 minutes. Rossi hasn't been asked to try the wing yet, but it'll be interesting to see if he's asked to play that role. Marco had a really good season, and he's had a great summer, Hines said. It's an interesting situation because Marco played really well with Foligno in a third-line slot. He's a guy that can produce offense. He's a responsible two-way player. He played well with Kaprizov and Zuccarello last year. You could see him in camp. Try him with Zuccarello and Kaprizov. You could also see him with Foligno and whoever we have on the wing. There's some flexibility there. But from everything we've seen, he's put in the work to come back and have another good season. He's going to get opportunities with some different people in camp and to see what fits. So reading the quote, a lot of the reaction can't be done until we see how this plays out. But it is a little frustrating to hear discussion about how much time a player has been putting in to be part of the mix, to put himself in position to do exactly what the team is asking. And it just never feels like it's enough. It doesn't feel like it is ever going to be enough for Marco Rossi here in Minnesota. And so we will continue today's show by taking a look at the numbers for some of the different line combinations that Rossi was a part of, and talking about whether there's a way to keep what was one of the best lines in hockey together while also getting some good balance from a line perspective. We'll also take a look at some projections for Marco Rossi this year and weigh in on whether or not those are achievable. So a lot more to get to here on today's Marco Rossi player preview. More on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you have heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. Best part about this, it doesn't even have to be a winning bet. You just throw $5 down on whoever is playing the New York Giants, or go take the Minnesota Twins or the Chicago White Sox, who have been playing pretty awfully over the last few weeks. $5 bet is all it takes for you to unlock this incredible trial of NFL Sunday Ticket. Don't miss out. This offer is only good through September 22nd. So head to FanDuel.com today to get things started. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For your second listen, make sure to check out the Locked On NHL podcast as we continue to go through burning questions for each team in the West. The Minnesota Wild were on tap today, and so you can listen into my thoughts as to the biggest question surrounding the Minnesota Wild ahead of the season. Back to the Marco Rossi conversation. I want to just go through MoneyPuck.com has many statistics to choose from based off of different line combinations for the season. We talked about this earlier in the offseason. The everydayers had a chance to already listen to some of these statistics, but again, I just want to paint a picture, and I know it's based off of what happened last season. It is still the same pieces, but just listen to these numbers from last season. Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson, Kirill, Kaprizov. They played 374.9 minutes together. Their expected goals percentage was 62.9%. And I'm even going to do one better here. I am going to take a look and see where that ranks. Minimum of, let's go 200. Let's see if it'll even allow me to do it here. Let's go 325 minutes minimum for the season. And there were 32 different combinations with a minimum of, we could even go to 350. There are 29 different line combinations that played at least 350 minutes together. The Minnesota Wild's combination of Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson and Kirill Kaprizov ranked second in the entire NHL in terms of expected goals percentage. Now, expected goals percentage, again, is the percentage of time if you're on the ice, a particular line combination is on the ice and a goal is scored, expected goals percentage is the percentage of time your team is the one scoring the goal. 63% of the time, it was Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson and Kirill Kaprizov last season. That was only behind Zach Hyman, Connor McDavid, and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. That was the only line that was better, and theirs was 66.6. In terms of expected goals for, Boldy, Eriksson, and Kaprizov were 17th, but the top combination of Lafreniere, Trocheck, and Panarin, who had an expected goals for of 45, they played 863 minutes together. So the fact that the Wild got 374.9, you double that, and they are right behind that top combination at 40, actually it would be 45.4. So they actually would be better if they had gotten that many minutes together on the season. That's how good they were last year. But there was a line combination that was better for the Minnesota Wild from an expected goals percentage. And that was Matt Zuccarello, Marco Rossi, and Ryan Hartman. They had an expected goals percentage of 65.9% in 64 minutes. And you look at the expected goals for of 22.7 for Boldy, Eriksson, and Kaprizov. The numbers for Kaprizov, Hartman, and Zuccarello last year, their expected goals percentage was 48.6. They played 142.5 minutes together and were actually outscored in on-ice situations. And so an expected goals for of 7, plus then your likely second line, which would be Boldy, Eriksson, and Johansson, their expected goals for of 9.2 gets you to 16.2. And so you are coming in under budget, so to speak, with those expected goals for those two lines, as opposed to keeping Boldy, Eriksson, and Kaprizov together, rolling with Zuccarello, Rossi, Hartman, which would give you then a expected goals for of 25.4 between the two of them, as opposed to 16.2, but with those previously aforementioned line combinations of Kaprizov, Hartman, Zuccarello, and Boldy, Eriksson, Johansson. So that's a 9-goal difference. And so I understand the prevailing thought. You can't win with one line, because you can't. But, and you know, I'll even do one better. Is, let's say that, you know, because we very likely could see these different types of combinations in training camp. If it doesn't work, okay, then don't go to it. Perfectly fine. But I'd like to see that top 6 at least get a shot if you're not going to go like the Liam Ogren route or the Riley Heidt route. I would like to see that top 6 get a shot, because I think that top 6 is capable of being pretty good. And then your third line would be something like Foligno, Trenin, and Murat Huzinadinov. Your fourth line is Loco, Gaudreau, and Johansson. Or you go Foligno, Trenin, Johansson, and Gaudreau, Loco, and you can figure out the bottom 6. The top 6 is the one we're worried about. That's the one that does all the scoring. But then looking at some of the other combinations that Marco Rossi was a part of, Matt Boldy, Marco Rossi, Kirill Kaprizov had an expected goals percentage of 54.5 in 81 minutes together. Kaprizov, Rossi, Zuccarello had an expected goals percentage of 53.7 in 313 minutes played together. And beyond that, the combinations in which Foligno and Rossi got time together, for the most part, the goals numbers were underwhelming, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens with the lineup. But the point that I'm making is, I think we've seen that Marco Rossi has the skill set that plays as an offensive driver. Now, he's not necessarily going to drive play himself, but it is entirely possible that if you just put somebody that's capable of shooting the puck on his wing, that he could get to the numbers that we're going to talk about here with his projection. And so for his role for the team this upcoming season, his ideal role, I still think it's as that number 2 center. And so we'll wait and see as to if that is actually the role that he gets an opportunity to have. Now, as far as statistical projections go, we will take a look at what ESPN has projected, because I'll tell you what, they're pretty optimistic as to what Marco Rossi is going to be capable of here for this season. So we'll talk about the numbers, and we'll also set the over-under for what to expect from Marco Rossi this year. That is all coming up as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. One final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. And once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. We are your team each and every day. Let's take a look at what ESPN is projecting from a fantasy perspective for Marco Rossi's numbers. Here's the outlook that they project. Rossi finally took on a full-time role for the Wild last season and had a nice year. He appeared in all 82 games, finished with 21 goals and 40 points. Set to play the entirety of this upcoming season at the age of 23, Rossi is theoretically a candidate for further production, but he would likely have to see an increased role with the man advantage for it to happen. Based on Minnesota's current personnel, that seems unlikely. Don't pay for a breakout that is unlikely to materialize for at least another season. ESPN is projecting Rossi for 32 goals, 28 assists, 60 total points, but a minus 20 on the season. And right around the same average time on ice. A big jump in shots from 167 this past year to 239 this upcoming season, which signed me immediately up for that type of volume, because we did see it as the season wore on, is that Rossi started to kind of, at the beginning of the season, he was a net front player that was able to take advantage of a bunch of different rebound opportunities and deflections. As the season wore on, we started to see him shoot from a little further out against opposing goalies. And so if he continues that and continues to get more comfortable with that, that would be fantastic. That would be a huge jump in his process, and one that I really would like to see him take, just continuing to develop that shot confidence that can keep propelling him as an offensive player. But like we talked about in the opening segment, we saw the combinations at the end of the season last year, and there just wasn't a ton of offense coming through in those capabilities. And I worry that if you put Rossi with Foligno and Trenin, that yes, that could be a line that could give you some pretty good defense. But are those two going to be able to help push the play towards the net enough to be able to create scoring opportunities? Foligno is a net front guy, and so you take Rossi out of that role, and for Yakov Trenin, pushing on offense isn't really his. That's not really his forte at this point. I just would rather, of the two, of Ryan Hartman and Marco Rossi, I would just much rather that you go and put a guy like Ryan Hartman on a more defense-oriented line and allow him to add the offense to it, as opposed to, like, because I just want to avoid the scenario that I see playing out in this instance is Rossi gets on a line with Foligno and Trenin, and that line has trouble scoring. And as we get further into the season, people are kind of, throwing their hands in the air and saying, well, geez, he's not producing like he did last year. Maybe he's not a good player, because that's not even remotely accurate. But this is something that we have seen from this Minnesota Wild coaching staff, is that guys are not necessarily put in the best positions to succeed for what they bring to the table. It's more so like, well, let's have this player do this because it works for what we're trying to do, as opposed to saying, well, here are Rossi's strengths. Let's see if we can't maximize them in the midst of our lineup. Because up until that, the production drop off at the end of the season, Rossi was head and shoulders. He was neck and neck in the Calder Trophy voting. Like he was a top 5, top 3 even early on in the season. And once the scoring kind of dried up, he started to fall off the pack a little bit. But like, get him some help, get him some support out there on that wing. Somebody that's capable of providing a shot, as opposed to having a guy in Matt Zuccarello who is at this point more of a passer. Having those two just play catch and then having kind of a third wheel. Like it just didn't work. And I'm not enthused really at all by the prospects of having those be your wings and then wondering where the offense comes from. Like those two don't drive offense. Find some players that do. I want to finish the discussion about Marco Rossi, because I think what we're going to do is this. I think because of what we have learned over the last 24 hours, that interview with John Hines, I'm going to set the over-under for Marco Rossi this year at 22 goals. Now, that may seem like a low number, but keep in mind, if he is, at least to start the season, if he's a third-line center, that's going to be a tricky number to get to. If he's put into that type of a role, if he's a second-line guy that periodically plays maybe top-line minutes, just kind of gets mixed in, it's much more attainable. But I'm going with 22 goals for Marco Rossi for the over-under this season, and we'll see what happens. But let me know in the comments if you think he will be over or under 22 goals. Also, just looking at the future of Marco Rossi's tenure here in Minnesota, he's going to be due for a contract extension during this season. The Wild could look to go that route. He is in the final year of his deal, and then will be a restricted free agent come next year. And again, I go back to, it just feels like it's never enough for the team. You've asked Marco Rossi to fully commit over the last 2 off seasons. He's done that in spades. You have given him an opportunity to, show what he's got. He did last year. And now, well, third line, maybe play a wing. Like, it doesn't seem to me like the things that you ask a player to do that you're not intent on keeping around. Now, that could entirely be me reading the tea leaves a bit too strongly, but like, Marco Rossi's a good player. And I think he's a piece that you can put into some of those core players for this team to build around. The one thing that he doesn't have is the size. But he brings a lot of other things that are really hard to find. And would love for the decision to be made to keep him around long term, but that's not my call to make. And so for Marco Rossi this year, the thing that I look for him doing is to just prove everybody wrong again. Like, if the team doesn't think that he is consistent enough to be a second line center, prove him wrong. Maybe play on the third line and give the other opportunities to Hartman and Eriksson. Prove him wrong. Marco Rossi's been proving people wrong his entire early part of his hockey career. And I look forward to him continuing to do that here in 2024, 2025. That'll do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we'll talk about the training camp roster for tomorrow's show. And I think we'll have another episode as well as we try to knock out these player previews. So double episode Wednesday for you here to get you closer to the start of the preseason. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.